The war had ended, but the ground remained heavy with the memory of its devastation. Across Europe, in places where soldiers had once lined up to face their enemies, now stood silent, half-completed structures. These were the underground bunkers, intended to serve as the last line of defense during the Second World War, but now abandoned, built for a war that had already been won. They dotted the landscape in numerous countries, from the cliffs of the English coast to the sprawling fields of France and the dense forests of Germany. These structures, so carefully engineered and resource-intensive, now faced an uncertain future. What had been conceived as military fortresses during a time of imminent threat quickly became relics of a world that no longer needed them. The post-war period was a time of profound logistical and economic stress. With the conclusion of the war in 1945, the countries involved shifted their attention from military production to the monumental task of rebuilding their devastated economies. In Germany, the situation was dire. A once thriving industrial base was in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble. The United Kingdom, having emerged victorious but financially crippled, struggled with its own problems, including a national debt that was at an all-time high. As for the Soviet Union, while it had achieved victory, its vast war machine had left the country in shambles, and its people were in desperate need of reconstruction, not further military expenditure. The bunkers, initially constructed to hold military personnel and vital resources, meant to withstand bombings, direct strikes, and even chemical warfare, were now a burden rather than a necessity. Tens of thousands of such structures were scattered across Europe. From the Atlantic Wall, stretching from Norway to France, to the extensive fortifications built by the Germans in their homeland, bunkers were a ubiquitous feature of the war landscape. The German military alone had constructed an estimated 15,000 bunkers throughout the conflict, each one often tailored for specific purposes, including command posts, ammunition storage, and shelters for troops. But by 1945, the bunker systems had already become anachronistic. In the face of rapid technological advancements and shifting military strategies, the bunkers no longer had the strategic value they once promised. The advent of jet aircraft, long-range missiles, and nuclear weapons had rendered traditional fortifications obsolete. The United States, now the predominant global military power, could project force with ease, making static defenses like the bunkers increasingly irrelevant. Even the Soviets, who had expanded their influence across Eastern Europe, had no need for these Cold War relics. In Britain, the post-war government quickly recognized the growing problem of surplus military infrastructure. Bunkers that had once housed the best of Britain's defenses were left empty. The Ministry of Works, tasked with managing the country's reconstruction, began the process of decommissioning these structures. They were seen not only as a drain on the national budget but also as symbols of an old war that the country had long moved on from. Many of the bunkers were abandoned outright, left to decay in the countryside, while others were earmarked for demolition. Yet, the sheer scale of the task was staggering. To dismantle the concrete fortifications, which were often up to 3 meters thick, required massive resources that the post-war economy could not spare. In France, the situation was similarly dire. The Germans had constructed a vast network of bunkers along the Atlantic coast, designed to protect against an Allied invasion. Following the war, these bunkers were no longer needed. Some were repurposed for civilian use, others were left to fall into ruin. In coastal areas, particularly in Normandy, local governments struggled with what to do with these imposing structures. Some saw potential in converting them into museums or historical sites, but for many, the immediate priority was simply to get rid of them, to make the landscape clean again. Large demolition projects were initiated, but the financial burden of this task often proved overwhelming, particularly for a country still recovering from the war's devastation. In Germany, the bunkers were not only a physical reminder of the war, but also a reminder of the Nazi regime that had built them. As the country struggled with its post-war identity, these structures became part of a larger process of reckoning with the past. Some bunkers were demolished by the occupying Allied forces, who were intent on erasing symbols of the Nazi war machine. In Berlin, the bunkers were often buried under rubble as the city itself was being rebuilt. However, many survived, hidden beneath the surface, forgotten, or repurposed in ways that would have been unimaginable during the war years. There were stories of bunkers becoming makeshift shelters for the displaced, for refugees pouring in from the east, and for those whose homes had been destroyed by bombings. In some cases, the bunkers were left as they were, forgotten and ignored, their once imposing structures overtaken by nature. Despite these early attempts at abandonment and demolition, many bunkers proved resilient, with some lasting well into the post-war decades. The sheer cost of dismantling these monolithic structures led to a strange paradox. It was often more economical to leave them standing, to let them decay naturally, than to invest the necessary resources in their destruction. This approach, however, was not without its consequences. Over time, many bunkers began to deteriorate, leaving behind dangerous ruins that posed safety risks for local populations. Some became havens for squatters and illegal activities. Others were repurposed in ways that reflected the changing needs of the Cold War era. In countries like the Soviet Union, the bunkers built during World War II were largely abandoned after the war ended. Yet, as the Cold War intensified, the Soviet military began to reconsider their utility. New bunkers were constructed during the 1950s and 1960s to defend against the threat of nuclear warfare. The earlier bunkers, once deemed obsolete, were now viewed through the lens of a new geopolitical reality. Yet the majority of the underground fortifications built during World War II remained, forgotten or ignored, their purpose already fulfilled and surpassed by new, more sophisticated structures. Across Europe, the fate of these bunkers unfolded unevenly. In some regions, such as the rural parts of France or England, the bunkers were forgotten entirely, blending into the landscape, overtaken by the passage of time. Others, however, became symbols of the past, historical landmarks, museums, or memorials, where the public could learn about the war and its lasting impact. And in a few cases, these bunkers were even incorporated into local economies, with private entities investing in their preservation for tourism or commercial use. The bunker network, once an integral part of wartime strategy, now found itself serving the needs of a post-war world that had little use for them. Yet for every bunker repurposed or left to stand as a silent witness, countless others were scrapped, buried, or forgotten. The original vision of the bunkers, an enduring fortress against invasion, a symbol of security in a world ravaged by war, was gone. What remained was a testament to a different time, an era when the future had seemed uncertain, and war was a constant presence in daily life. But as the world moved on, the bunkers faded from memory, victims of an age that no longer needed them, and a war that had long since ended. The fate of the bunkers, and the many others like them, would not be decided in a single year or even a single decade. The process of dismantling, repurposing, or abandoning these structures stretched well into the 1950s and 1960s, a gradual process that was often marked by a sense of futility, as if the war that had created them had not ended but simply shifted into a different phase, one of indifference, neglect, and pragmatic necessity. The 1950s and 1960s were decades of transition. The bunkers, which had once been symbols of defensive strategy and military strength, were now relics of an era that had already passed. What had been envisioned as the last line of defense, shielded from the horrors of war above, was now forced to contend with a different kind of threat, the erosion of time and the shifting priorities of a world rebuilding from the ashes of the Second World War. As new global powers emerged and the Cold War began to dominate international affairs, the strategic importance of these underground fortresses became increasingly irrelevant. The world had changed, and the bunkers, for better or worse, had become symbols of an outdated age. In the early 1950s, many countries that had once been heavily invested in constructing bunkers for wartime survival now found themselves struggling with the realities of post-war reconstruction. The war's end had left economies in tatters, requiring massive efforts for rebuilding. In Germany, where the burden of war had been the heaviest, the bunker's continued existence presented a significant economic challenge. The cost of maintaining, demolishing, or repurposing these structures weighed heavily on a nation struggling to recover from the devastation of total war. The newly formed West Germany, under the influence of the United States and its allies, focused on economic recovery and integration into the Western Bloc, which often meant finding ways to put the remnants of war to practical use. In many cases, the bunkers were left to decay. The German military leadership had already shifted its priorities to a modernized force capable of engaging in the new realities of the Cold War. The bunkers, with their thick concrete walls and outdated designs, had no place in this new paradigm. In other parts of Europe, the fate of the bunkers varied considerably. In the United Kingdom, the Ministry of Works, which had initially overseen the post-war dismantling of military structures, found itself grappling with the sheer scale of the task. The cost of demolishing hundreds, if not thousands, of these concrete structures across the country was prohibitive. Some were buried, hidden beneath the earth, or simply left to rot in quiet corners of the countryside. Yet, certain bunkers that were deemed to have historical significance, especially those linked to Britain's military past, were preserved as museums, memorials, or even tourist attractions. A few examples remain today, scattered across the coastline of Britain, reminders of a time when the nation was under constant threat of invasion. But for the majority, the bunkers were either forgotten or destroyed, buried beneath the soil of post-war Britain's economic challenges. France, with its own troubled history in the aftermath of the war, faced similar issues. The bunkers built by the Germans during the occupation were largely abandoned after liberation. The government initially sought to remove these reminders of a painful past, but the costs were too high, and the priority was instead placed on rebuilding the country. Many bunkers were left to degrade naturally, becoming part of the landscape, often overrun by vegetation and wildlife. Others, particularly those on the coast, were incorporated into the growing tourism industry. These fortifications, which had been constructed with such grim precision to repel Allied forces during the war, were now converted into attractions for curious visitors interested in the history of the occupation. However, the majority of these structures remained largely forgotten, overtaken by time. As the Cold War took hold in the 1950s and 1960s, the bunkers began to experience a strange paradox. In some places, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the very concept of underground fortifications began to regain prominence. The Soviet Union, in particular, began to invest heavily in new forms of military defense, including a vast network of nuclear bunkers. But the bunkers constructed during the Second World War were often seen as outdated, unable to withstand the more sophisticated threats of the Cold War era. Many were simply left to decay. Some, however, were repurposed as emergency shelters or secret military installations. In countries that were under Soviet influence, the bunkers were sometimes used for other purposes, such as storage for supplies or as facilities for scientific research. But the vast majority of the bunkers across Europe were abandoned, left to rot or buried under the weight of progress and the relentless march of time. In Britain, the 1960s saw a renewed interest in the bunkers. The threat of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union made many feel the need for reinforced structures. The British government, in an effort to prepare for the worst, began constructing new underground facilities designed to protect political leaders and essential personnel in the event of a nuclear attack. These new bunkers, built to withstand atomic bombs, were far more advanced than the bunkers of the Second World War. Many were built deep underground with sophisticated ventilation and water filtration systems, and were designed to house government officials and military personnel for extended periods of time. But the old wartime bunkers, now obsolete in the face of the new nuclear threat, were of little use. They were left behind, a symbol of a bygone era. Yet, the bunkers' existence did not end with their abandonment. Over time, they became part of the cultural fabric of post-war Europe. Some of the bunkers, particularly those along the former front lines of the war, began to attract attention as historical sites. They were viewed not just as remnants of military strategy, but as tangible markers of the war's profound impact on the continent. In the United Kingdom, several bunkers were preserved as part of the Imperial War Museum, where they were showcased as a way to understand the military strategies of the time and the scale of the conflict. In France, certain bunkers on the Atlantic coast became tourist destinations, their military past now repurposed to tell the story of the war to new generations. But the preservation of these structures was by no means universal. Many of the bunkers remained abandoned, decaying into nothingness, as resources were allocated to other more pressing needs of the post-war recovery. The final fate of the bunkers was decided, in many ways, by the sheer cost of maintenance. These enormous structures, built from steel-reinforced concrete, were designed to last, but they also required constant upkeep. The countries of post-war Europe were simply unable or unwilling to dedicate the resources necessary to preserve these monuments to war. In Germany, most of the bunkers were left to slowly deteriorate, some forgotten entirely, others buried under new construction. In the Soviet Union, a few were repurposed for military purposes, but the majority were abandoned. Even in countries like France and the United Kingdom, where some bunkers were preserved for historical purposes, many others were lost to time. But despite their abandonment, the bunkers still served as a lasting reminder of the war that had once consumed the world. Today, they stand as symbols not of victory or defeat, but of a time when the future seemed uncertain, and nations invested heavily in building the structures that would safeguard them from a future threat. And even now, decades after the war's end, these bunkers remain scattered across Europe, relics of a world that was slowly but surely moving away from the shadows of global conflict. Their fate, ultimately, was one of quiet decay or repurposing, a quiet tribute to the complex legacy of the war that had created them. The bunkers, designed for a war that never came, now stand as silent witnesses to the passing of an era.